Maxine Waters arrived at the Senate hearing wearing a $3,000 designer suit to discuss financial accountability, which felt a lot like Al Capone showing up in a Rolls-Royce to talk about tax compliance. Waters swept into the room with the confidence of someone who'd been in Congress so long she'd genuinely forgotten what accountability felt like. She had all her talking points ready. Evil banks, greedy corporations, and the desperate need for more regulation were on her mind. She was primed to perform for the cameras, eager to get her sound bites for MSNBC, and essentially do what she'd been doing for 33 years, talking a lot while achieving absolutely nothing. Kennedy, on the other hand, sat at the dais looking as if he'd just wandered in from a catfish fry. He wore that perpetually confused expression that usually made people underestimate him right before he'd completely demolished them with facts. His legal pad was filled with notes. His southern accent was noticeably strong. His reading glasses were perched on his nose at an angle that suggested he might need help finding them, even though they were undeniably on his face. Waters smiled at him. She probably thought he was some backwoods lawyer who'd be easy to fool with big words and righteous indignation. Big mistake. A truly enormous one. The hearing began normally enough. Waters was scheduled to discuss banking regulation and oversight, her supposed area of expertise as the chair of the House Financial Services Committee. She immediately launched into her prepared remarks about holding financial institutions accountable, about protecting consumers, and about ensuring big banks truly served the people instead of just themselves. It was a powerful speech. She'd delivered variations of it hundreds of times. The righteous indignation was well practiced. The moral outrage was perfectly on cue. The finger-pointing was purely theatrical. She was right in her element, or so she believed. Kennedy listened politely, nodding occasionally and jotting down small notes. He waited until she finished her opening statement, let the applause from her supporters die down, and then leaned into his microphone with that particular smile. The one that looks friendly, until you realize it's the exact same expression a cat gets right before it presents you with a dead mouse. Congresswoman Waters, that truly was a beautiful speech. Truly moving. You talk about accountability like you invented the concept, which is quite interesting because I've been doing some research on accountability, specifically on whether you've ever actually demonstrated any. Waters blinked. That line was definitely not in the script. I have some questions, Kennedy continued, his voice a slow drawl that made every word sound like it was being served with sweet tea. They're about your finances, your district, your family's very lucrative consulting business, and a bank that received $12 million in bailout money right after you made some phone calls. But before we get to all that, he said, pulling out a thick folder. It landed on the desk with a thud that echoed throughout the chamber. I want to make sure we're using the same definition of accountability because where I'm from, accountability means you are fully responsible for your actions. You answer for your conduct. You face consequences when you do something wrong. Is that the same definition you're using? I just want to be sure we're speaking the same language before we proceed. Waters' smile had frozen on her face as if someone had hit pause mid-expression. What happened next wasn't just a hearing. It became an 8-round prosecution. A truly Southern fried destruction. A masterclass in how to dismantle a career politician using nothing but their own record, and that deadly combination of politeness and precision that only comes from Louisiana. Maxine Waters came to lecture about accountability. She left understanding exactly what it means. And if you think that's hyperbole, just wait until you see what Kennedy had in that folder. Kennedy opened the folder with the careful attention of someone handling something slightly unpleasant, like a biology teacher presenting a dissected frog to a class of squeamish freshmen. "Congresswoman," he began, You chair the House Financial Services Committee. That's an incredibly powerful position. You oversee banks, regulate financial institutions, and control legislation affecting the entire banking industry. It's almost like being able to pick winners and losers, he added. He paused, looking up over his reading glasses. Which brings me to One United Bank. You remember One United, don't you? Waters's jaw tightened slightly. One United is a minority-owned bank that apparently serves your husband's investment portfolio, Kennedy gently interrupted. Let me lay out a timeline for everyone. It's 2008. The financial crisis is in full swing. Banks are failing. The government creates TARP, the Troubled Asset Relief Program. That's taxpayer money intended to bail out failing banks. Everyone with me so far? He didn't wait for confirmation. Now, One United Bank is in serious trouble. Bad investments, poor management, all the usual problems that cause banks to fail. Usually, a small bank like One United wouldn't even be considered for a bailout, but there was one crucial detail. Kennedy then pulled out a document. It stated that your husband, Sidney Williams, owned at least $250,000 in One United stock. That's $250,000. And if One United were to fail, that stock would become completely worthless, which certainly wouldn't be great for the Williams family finances. He held the documents up for the cameras to clearly see. So, what happened next is actually quite interesting. In September 2008, you personally called Treasury Secretary Henry Paulson. You, the Congresswoman, whose husband held $250,000 in One United stock, called the Treasury Secretary to discuss One United Bank. Then, you arranged a meeting between Treasury officials and One United executives. Kennedy pulled out even more documents, fanning them out like a poker player revealing a winning hand. Treasury officials later testified that they felt this meeting was inappropriate. They called it unusual. They felt it seemed like special treatment. But despite that, the meeting still went ahead. And then, guess what happened? One United ended up receiving $12 million in TARP funds. That's $12 million of taxpayer money. He looked directly at Waters. Your husband's stock was saved. The bank your family had invested in got bailed out with taxpayer money, all after you personally intervened. And the House Ethics Committee investigated, finding that you had indeed violated House rules. You brought a matter before the government, where you had a personal financial interest. That's the literal definition of corruption. Waters attempted to interrupt him, but Kennedy rolled right over her like a Louisiana flood. Now, the Ethics Committee merely admonished you. That's Washington speak for, we caught you red-handed, but we're not actually going to punish you because you're powerful and connected. You simply got a slap on the wrist. No fine, no censure, no expulsion, just don't do it again and try to be less obvious next time. Kennedy leaned back then, shaking his head with exaggerated disbelief. Let me just make sure I understand this correctly. In 2008, while banks were failing and people were losing their homes and their life savings, you used your position as a member of Congress to arrange a $12 million taxpayer-funded bailout for a bank where your husband had personally invested $250,000. You personally benefited. Your family's finances were protected, and your only punishment was being told that what you did was naughty. He pulled off his glasses, slowly cleaning them with his tie. Congresswoman, if I owned stock in a bank and then used my Senate position to get that bank bailout money, I'd be in federal prison. Martha Stewart went to prison for insider trading involving just $45,000. Your family benefited from a $12 million bailout you arranged, yet you merely got admonished. Kennedy put his glasses back on. That's not accountability. That's actually the complete opposite of accountability. That's Washington protecting its own. And you're still here, still chairing the committee that oversees banks, still lecturing people about financial ethics. The irony is so incredibly thick, I'm practically choking on it. Waters's face turned red. I was helping a minority-owned bank serve the community. You were helping your husband's stock portfolio, Kennedy said flatly. The community ended up with $12 million in taxpayer debt. Your husband, however, got to keep his investment. Some service, indeed. The taxpayers essentially bailed out your family's bad investment. And you call that public service, ma'am? That's not public service. That's more like public theft, with a better PR strategy. And that was just the opening round. Kennedy had 7 more loaded questions ready. Share this. Kennedy then pulled out a new section from the folder. This particular section was marked with bright yellow tabs. He looked at it, then at Waters, then back at the folder, as if trying to decide if he could even believe what he was reading. Congresswoman, let's talk about your daughter now, Karen Waters. She's a consultant in political consulting and quite successful at it. Very well paid, which is quite impressive, considering her only apparent qualification seems to be that she's your daughter. He pulled out FEC reports, then held them up. Karen runs a company that specifically handles slate mailers. You know what those are? They're basically flyers designed to tell voters who to vote for. Any print shop can easily make them. They typically cost about $5,000 to $10,000 for a regular campaign. Kennedy set down one report, then picked up another. Your campaign pays Karen's company anywhere from $75,000 to $150,000 per election cycle for these slate mailers. That's a staggering 10 to 15 times the actual market rate. But it actually gets even better, or worse, depending on if you're Karen or one of the donors whose money is going to her. He spread out reports covering multiple election cycles before him. Since 2004, your campaign has paid Karen over $1.2 million. That's $1.2 million for services that probably should have cost maybe $100,000 total over that entire period. She's been paid 10 times what those services are actually worth. Kennedy then looked up with exaggerated confusion. Now, I'm just a simple country lawyer, but even I can easily do that math. You're paying your daughter 10 times the market rate, using donor money and campaign funds. That's quite a family business model, wouldn't you say? He pulled out even more documents. But it's not just your campaigns doing this. Other politicians are paying Karen too. These are politicians who want your endorsement. Politicians who really need your support. Politicians who seem to understand that the path to Maxine's heart goes right through Karen's bank account. Kennedy began reading from a list. In 2020, he stated, your campaign alone paid Karen $250,000. And other campaigns she worked on, every single one that got your endorsement, paid her similar amounts. The pattern here is incredibly clear. Hire Karen, and you get Maxine's support. Don't hire Karen? Well, good luck getting Maxine's help then. He then set the list down and looked at Waters very seriously. Ma'am, what you've essentially created is a pay-to-play scheme, with your daughter right in the middle. Politicians who want your backing end up hiring your daughter at seriously inflated rates. Your daughter gets rich, of course, and you maintain plausible deniability by simply saying you don't control who hires her. Meanwhile, the political establishment gets to funnel money right to your family, all in exchange for your influence. Waters began to respond, but Kennedy just kept going. Yes, the FEC does allow family members to work for campaigns. That part is legal. But paying them 10 times the market rate? That right there, is converting campaign funds directly for personal family benefit. That's actively using your political position to enrich your own family. And you've apparently been doing this for 20 years. Kennedy then pulled out one more document. This is an analysis provided by a campaign finance watchdog group. They calculated that if Karen had only been paid market rates for her services, she would have earned around $150,000 over the past 2 decades. Instead, she's made over $1 million. That's a staggering $850,000 in excess payments directly to your daughter. That's not consulting fees by any stretch. That's tribute paid to your family, simply for access to your power. He looked at Waters with that familiar theatrical expression of puzzlement. Your daughter charges 15 times what a standard print shop would charge for the exact same service. The only thing that could possibly justify that kind of premium is her last name. She's not actually selling consulting services. She's selling access to you, and you're allowing it because, well, your family profits from it. Kennedy then leaned forward. Congresswoman, you've effectively turned your political position into a personal family ATM. Your daughter gets rich. You keep power, all while donors and taxpayers fund it. And you call it legitimate business. Ma'am, the only thing truly legitimate about this is that you've technically managed to stay within the loopholes that you and your colleagues created, precisely to enrich yourselves. Waters was shaking her head in disagreement. My daughter provides valuable consulting services, she insisted. At 15 times the market rate? Kennedy's voice went up. Congresswoman, I've run campaigns myself. I know what slate mailers actually cost. And I know what consultants typically charge. Your daughter's rates are just absurd. Unless, of course, the real service she's providing is access to you. That's not consulting at all. That's money laundering your political influence directly through your daughter's LLC. 2 rounds into this, and Waters was clearly getting defensive. But Kennedy? He was just getting warmed up. Kennedy then pulled out a brand new stack of documents. These ones had charts and statistics meticulously clipped to them. He made a point of reviewing them slowly, shaking his head gently as if reading a particularly tragic story unfold. Congresswoman, you've been representing California's 43rd Congressional District since way back in 1991. That's 33 years, an entire third of a century, truly. An entire generation. So, let's talk about how that district is actually doing under your leadership, shall we? He held up a large map. California's 43rd encompasses parts of South Los Angeles, along with Englewood, and portions of Gardena and Hawthorne. These are historically African-American communities, hard-working families, precisely the people you claim to represent. The people you say you fight for. Kennedy then pulled out a sheet of statistics. Back in 1991, when you first took office, the poverty rate in your district stood at about 23%. Today, it's a staggering 31%. And no, that's not a typo. After 33 years of your representation, poverty has actually increased by a full 8 percentage points. More people are struggling with poverty now than when you first started. He continued reading from even more data. The median household income in your district? It's $45,000. Do you know what the California state average is? $84,000. Your constituents, Congresswoman, make about half of what other Californians earn. The crime rate there is among the highest in the state, and the high school graduation rate is among the very lowest. Homelessness, too, has exploded during your tenure. Kennedy then set the statistics down and pulled out a series of photos. But you, Congresswoman, you're not suffering, are you? This right here is a picture of your house. A $4.5 million residence in Hancock Park. A truly beautiful place. 6 bedrooms, 7 bathrooms, a pool, the whole 9 yards. Very, very nice indeed. He held the photo up high so everyone in the room could see it clearly. Hancock Park. That's one of the absolute wealthiest neighborhoods in all of Los Angeles. The average home price there is around $3 million. It's where old money makes its home. Gated streets, private security. Not a lot of crime happening in Hancock Park. Kennedy pulled out a map, and then he pointed. Now, here's the really interesting part. Hancock Park, Congresswoman, is not actually in your district. You represent South Los Angeles, yet you don't actually live there. Instead, you reside in one of LA's wealthiest neighborhoods, all while serving some of California's most struggling residents. You literally drive past homeless encampments, commuting from your mansion to your office. He now looked at Waters with genuine curiosity. So, when exactly did you move out of the district? Did it happen gradually? Did you wake up one morning and think, I've done such an amazing job for these people that I totally deserve to live somewhere better? Or was your plan always to profit from this position and leave as soon as you could afford to? Waters attempted to speak. Kennedy raised a hand. I'm honestly asking because I've been a senator for 8 years, and I still call Louisiana home. Not in some fancy part, but in the exact same house I lived in before being elected. I shop at the same grocery stores my constituents do. I see them at church. I live right alongside the people I represent, because that's the true meaning of representation. He then pointed to the photo of the mansion. But you live in a $4.5 million mansion, in a neighborhood your constituents can't even afford to drive through, all on a salary of $174,000 a year. You've served in Congress for 33 years. Even with perfect savings and zero expenses, you still couldn't afford that house on your salary alone. So, where did all that money actually come from? Kennedy then pulled out some financial disclosure forms. Your net worth is estimated to be between $2 and $6 million. Your salary is $174,000. Your husband is retired. Your daughter works as a consultant, but her income is entirely her own. So, just how did you manage to accumulate millions? He then answered his own question. Stock trading, speaking fees, book deals, consulting fees, all those ways politicians transform public service into private profit. You've spent 33 years monetizing your congressional seat, all while your constituents have gotten poorer. Kennedy's voice hardened. You've represented South Los Angeles for 33 long years. During that time, poverty soared, crime rose, homelessness exploded, and graduation rates plummeted. Every single measure of success has actually worsened. But you got richer. You got more powerful. You even bought a mansion outside your district. He gathered the pile of statistics back together. Ma'am, that's not what I call representation. That's extraction. You've extracted wealth from your position, while your constituents have gained nothing but misery. After 33 years, if your district is worse off, that's not just bad luck. That's not Republican obstruction. That's not systemic racism. That is squarely your leadership failure. Waters was now visibly enraged. I've fought for my district for decades, yet they've gotten poorer while you've gotten richer, Kennedy cut in. After 33 years, the results truly speak for themselves. You don't even live there anymore. You represent South LA from a mansion in Hancock Park. That tells your constituents everything they need to know about where your priorities truly lie. They're certainly not in Hancock Park. That's 3 rounds, 3 undeniable exposures of corruption. Just keep watching. It actually gets worse. Kennedy then pulled out what appeared to be a collection of transcripts. They were thick stacks of paper, all held together by binder clips. He lifted them with an exaggerated effort, as if they weighed far more than they should. Congresswoman, you've been incredibly vocal about impeachment over the years, truly passionate. Some might even say obsessed. Let me share some numbers with you now. He opened the very first transcript. In March 2017, just 2 months after President Trump took office, you loudly called for his impeachment. Here's the direct quote. He should be impeached. No investigation had happened yet. No evidence, just your personal opinion that he absolutely should be impeached. Kennedy then flipped through more transcripts. April 2017, you called for impeachment. May 2017, you called for impeachment again. You were on CNN, MSNBC, essentially anywhere that would let you say, impeach 45. You said it so frequently that it became your personal catchphrase. You even had supporters making signs with it. You were known as the impeachment lady. He then pulled out a tally sheet. I had my staff actually count. Between January 2017 and December 2020, you called for President Trump's impeachment on television or in public statements 28 times. That's 28 times. That's 7 times a year. Once every 7 weeks, you were more consistent about calling for impeachment than most people are about going to church. Kennedy then set down the transcripts. Now, here's what truly interests me. During those 4 years, you were so obsessed with impeachment. What exactly were you doing for your district? What bills did you actually pass to help South Los Angeles? What legislation did you sponsor to specifically reduce poverty or crime? He then pulled out her legislative record. Let me read this to you. Bills passed to directly help your district during the Trump years. 0. Committee hearings held in your district to address local concerns. Also 0. Federal funding secured specifically for South LA, minimal. But TV appearances calling for impeachment. Dozens. Kennedy looked up at her. For 4 years, you were focused on trying to remove a president instead of actually helping your constituents, all while you were on MSNBC calling for impeachment as homelessness in Los Angeles exploded. Meanwhile, you were on CNN demanding investigations, but crime in your own district was soaring. As you built your media brand as a resistance fighter, your constituents were truly suffering. Then, he pulled out even more data. Throughout the Trump presidency, homelessness in LA County actually jumped by 63%. That's 63%. Your district, in particular, was among the hardest hit areas. Did you hold hearings to address that homelessness? Did you propose any legislation to tackle it? Or were you just too busy calling for impeachment? The answer was a resounding yes. Waters attempted to defend herself. She claimed, I was simply holding a lawless president accountable. No, Kennedy stated flatly, you were building your media profile. You were getting a lot of airtime on cable news. You were becoming a hashtag, even a meme. You were doing everything but your actual job, which is supposed to be representing the people of South Los Angeles. He then leaned forward. Congresswoman, he continued, your constituents didn't elect you to be a cable news pundit. They certainly didn't elect you to get into Twitter fights with the president. Instead, they elected you to represent their interests in Congress, to pass legislation, to secure funding, and to ultimately make their lives better. Yet, all you gave them were impeachment speeches. Kennedy then pulled out some polling data. Here's what your constituents actually think, he said. In a 2020 poll, a staggering 68% of your district stated that homelessness was their absolute top concern. But do you know what percentage said impeaching Trump was their top concern? Just 14%. Still, You spent all your time on that 14% issue because it guaranteed you a spot on TV. He set the poll results back down. You weren't serving your constituents at all. You were serving your ego. You were serving your political brand. You were serving every single interest except for the very people who elected you. And they just kept getting poorer, while you, meanwhile, kept getting more famous. Kennedy's voice had grown sharp now. After 33 years in Congress, your legacy should be what you built for your district. Instead, your legacy is Impeach 45 and a mansion in Hancock Park. That's not what public service looks like. That's public performance, and it's happening at the expense of the people you're actually supposed to serve. 4 devastating rounds of destruction. But Kennedy had 4 more rounds coming. Kennedy's expression then shifted. This next part wasn't about corruption or incompetence. This one was personal, and his voice carried an edge it hadn't had before. "Congresswoman," he began, "let's talk about your rhetoric. You're clearly very passionate when you speak. Some might even call it inflammatory. Some might even say you've crossed the line from merely passionate to downright dangerous." He pulled out some video footage and queued it up on the monitors. April 2021, Brooklyn Center, Minnesota. The Derek Chauvin trial. You flew there during that trial, which, as you know, judges generally don't like. And you spoke directly to the protesters. "Here's what you actually said," he revealed. The video then began to play. Waters' voice was heard saying, "We've got to stay on the street. We've got to get more confrontational. We've got to make sure they know we mean business." Kennedy paused the video. "Get more confrontational?" That was your advice to protesters during an active trial, in a city already clearly on edge. The judge presiding over the case even said, "Your comments could cause a mistrial." "Let me read his exact words," Kennedy continued. "A congresswoman's statement may place the trial in jeopardy. The judge actually considered declaring a mistrial because of your rhetoric." He then pulled out news reports from that very night. After your comments, protests spiraled into more violence, more property damage, more injuries, and more chaos. You lit a match, and then you simply left. You flew back to California, letting Brooklyn Center deal with the resulting fire. Kennedy then pulled out some older footage. "But that's not your first time inciting people to action," he pointed out. Back in June 2018, here's what you said about Trump administration officials. "If you see anybody from that cabinet in a restaurant, in a department store, or at a gasoline station, you get out there, you create a crowd, you push back on them, and you tell them they're not welcome anymore, anywhere." He then looked up from the transcript. You literally told people to harass government officials, to create crowds, and to make them unwelcome anywhere. And you know what happened? People actually listened. Sarah Sanders got kicked out of a restaurant. Mitch McConnell was harassed right at his home. Ted Cruz was chased out of a restaurant. You gave them permission, and your supporters acted on it. Kennedy then pulled out even more examples. You've constantly called for confrontation. You've actively encouraged harassment. You've used inflammatory language time and time again. And when your words lead to violence or harassment, you never apologize. You never take responsibility. You just claim First Amendment protection and then move right on to your next inflammatory statement. He then leaned back in his chair. "But here's the double standard," he declared. When Donald Trump said, "Fight like hell," on January 6th, you said he incited an insurrection. You even voted to impeach him specifically for his rhetoric. You yourself said, "Words matter." You said leaders are accountable for what their supporters do after they hear their words. Kennedy pointed at her. But when you tell people to get confrontational, that's a different story. When you tell people to harass officials, that's supposedly protected speech. When your words lead to violence, that's just passion. Ma'am, you can't have it both ways. Either rhetoric has real consequences or it doesn't. Either leaders are responsible for inciting people or they're not. Waters was shaking her head. I have every right to speak passionately about injustice. You absolutely have a right to speak, Kennedy agreed. You don't, however, have a right to incite violence and harassment. When you tell people to get confrontational, and they do, you are the one who bears responsibility. When you tell people to harass officials, and they actually go and do it, that falls squarely on you. You can't play the victim when you're the one issuing the commands. He then pulled out the January 6th committee report. The January 6th committee spent 2 entire years looking into Trump's rhetoric. They carefully analyzed his words. They showed exactly how his language led to violence. They held him responsible for incitement. But they never once investigated you. They never analyzed your own rhetoric. They never held you accountable for telling people to be more confrontational. Why is that? Because politically, you were on their side. Kennedy's voice grew harsher. That isn't justice at all. That's just partisan prosecution. Trump's rhetoric counts as incitement, yet yours is labeled activism. Trump's words cause violence, but yours are simply passionate. You are either both guilty or both innocent in this situation. You don't get to hold him to a standard. You refuse to meet yourself. He looked directly at Waters. You are a leader. You have a public platform. Your words carry weight. When you tell people to get confrontational, some of them absolutely will. When you tell them to harass officials, some of them definitely will. You cannot pretend that you don't know that. You are responsible for the results of your rhetoric. And so far, you've faced absolutely none. 5 rounds. Waters looked visibly rattled. 3 more are coming. Share this. Kennedy pulled out appropriation bills, which were thick legislative documents with certain sections highlighted in bright yellow. He opened one to a page he'd marked, squinting at the tiny print. Congresswoman, you serve on the House Appropriations Committee. That's the committee where spending bills begin. That's where special earmarks get added in. That's where taxpayer money gets directed to very specific projects. It's a very powerful position to hold. It offers plenty of opportunities for, shall we say, creative spending. He looked up over his reading glasses. Let's discuss where some of that money actually goes. Specifically, let's talk about organizations in your district that receive federal funds and then, coincidentally, end up hiring your daughter. Kennedy then pulled out a flow chart. I made a diagram myself because I'm a visual learner. Here's precisely how it operates. Step 1. You direct a federal earmark to a community organization. Step 2. That organization hires Karen Waters as a consultant. Step 3. Karen receives payment, often directly from the federal funds you just appropriated. Step 4. The organization and its leaders contribute money to your campaign. Step 5. You repeat the whole process. He pointed to specific examples right there on the chart. In 2019, you secured a $1 million earmark for a South LA community development organization. Just 3 months later, that organization hired Karen for $75,000 in consulting fees. 6 months after that, the organization's board members and their families gave the maximum donations allowed to your campaign. That totaled $48,000. Kennedy then moved on to show another example. In 2020, there was a $500,000 earmark to a housing nonprofit in your district. 2 months later, Karen's company secured a contract for $90,000. 4 months after that, the nonprofit's executives and their relatives donated to your campaign. It's an interesting pattern, wouldn't you say? He pulled out even more examples. In 2020 and 2021, $300,000 went to a job training program. Karen received $60,000 in consulting fees. Campaign donations then followed right behind. In 2022, $400,000 went to a youth services organization. Karen received $50,000. More donations continued to pour in over and over again. It was the exact same pattern every time. Kennedy set down the flow chart and then pulled out some accounting records. The FBI could easily investigate this as money laundering. Here's precisely why. Taxpayer funds are appropriated directly by you. Those funds are then directed to various organizations. Those organizations then pay your daughter at rates above market value. Those organizations then return money to you through campaign donations. The taxpayer money completes a full circle, from the Treasury to the organization to your daughter, and then back to you. Everyone wins in this scenario, except for the taxpayers who originally funded it. He looked at Waters with a serious expression now. Ma'am, you have effectively created a money laundering scheme by using federal appropriations. It's technically legal, because you've written the rules yourself to permit it. But legal and ethical are not the same exact thing. You are taking taxpayer money, funneling it through nonprofits to your daughter, and receiving campaign donations as a direct return. That, by any reasonable standard, is corruption. Waters tried her best to defend herself. These are genuinely impactful community organizations, yet they hired your daughter at inflated rates right after you showered them with federal money. Kennedy quickly cut in. Congresswoman, he began, let's put this to the test. Would these organizations have hired Karen if you weren't their representative in Congress? Would they have paid her $90,000 for consulting if you hadn't just secured them $1 million earmark? Or is bringing Karen on board simply the cost of doing business to get your backing? He leaned forward, his gaze direct. You've transformed federal funding into a personal enrichment program for your family. Taxpayer dollars flow into your district. A portion of it goes straight to your daughter. Then, campaign donations find their way back to you, and somehow you label this community service. But let's be clear, the community isn't being served here. It's your family that's benefiting. You've managed to privatize the profits while socializing the costs. Taxpayers foot the bill. Your daughter reaps the financial rewards, and your constituents see absolutely no real improvement. Kennedy then pulled out yet another document. This is an in-depth analysis from a government watchdog group, he announced. They meticulously tracked every federal earmark you've secured over the past decade and cross-referenced it with your daughter's list of clients. And want to know what they found? A staggering 63% of organizations that received your earmarks ended up hiring Karen within the very next year. 63%. That's not merely a coincidence. That's an established system. He set the document down with an air of finality. You, Congresswoman, have institutionalized corruption. You've refined it into a system, a predictable process, a literal business model. And because, technically, it's all legal, you face absolutely no repercussions. However, the American public sees exactly what you're doing. They fully grasp that you've turned public service into a pathway for family profit, and they are utterly fed up with it. 6 investigations into corruption. 2 more rounds for you, folks, if you're still watching. Kennedy then produced what appeared to be a textbook, a basic economics primer. He opened it to a page he'd bookmarked, read for a moment, then looked at Waters with a visibly exaggerated look of confusion. "Congresswoman," he stated, "you currently chair the House Financial Services Committee. You're responsible for regulating banks, overseeing the Federal Reserve, and controlling financial legislation that impacts trillions of dollars. So, I'm just going to assume you have a firm grasp of basic economics and fundamental banking principles." He then closed the textbook. "Let's put that assumption to the test. I'm going to ask you a few simple questions, nothing tricky, just fundamental concepts that anyone in charge of regulating our financial system really ought to know." Kennedy pulled out his legal pad. "First question, just approximately, what is the current federal funds rate?" "No need to be precise." Waters blinked slowly. "The federal funds rate it's established by the Federal Reserve to control—" Kennedy simply waited. Waters' voice trailed off, unable to finish. "You don't know," Kennedy stated, not as a question, but as a pronouncement. "The single most crucial interest rate in the entire American economy. The rate that influences every other rate, and you have no idea what it is." "All right, let's try something a bit easier," he suggested. He quickly jotted down a note. "Can you explain quantitative easing? Specifically, what is it, and how exactly does it function?" Waters straightened herself up. "Quantitative easing is when the Federal Reserve acquires assets to stimulate the economy by boosting the money supply and consequently lowering interest rates." Kennedy gave a slow nod. "That's indeed the textbook definition," he acknowledged. "Now, could you explain how it actually works? What specific assets are being purchased? How does the act of buying them genuinely increase the money supply? And what are the inherent risks involved?" Silence filled the room. "You've memorized the definition perfectly, but you clearly don't grasp the underlying mechanism," Kennedy observed. "Let's move on to another one. What precisely is the distinction between monetary policy and fiscal policy?" Waters offered a vague response, touching on government spending and Federal Reserve policy. Kennedy pressed for more specific details. She was utterly unable to provide them. "Congresswoman, these are not complex inquiries," Kennedy asserted. "These are the absolute fundamentals. You've served on the Financial Services Committee for 3 decades. You've held the position of chair since 2019. You are tasked with regulating the most intricate financial system globally. Yet, you cannot articulate basic concepts that any economics undergraduate would effortlessly know." Kennedy then pulled up video footage of Waters herself, questioning various bank CEOs during past committee hearings. "Let's take a look at some of your own questioning, shall we?" he suggested. "Here you are, asking J.P. Morgan CEO Jamie Dimon about student loans." The video clip began to play. Waters posed a question that clearly demonstrated a fundamental misunderstanding of how bank capital requirements actually operate. Dimon, with utmost politeness, attempted to clarify. Waters proceeded to talk right over him, evidently failing to grasp his explanation. Kennedy paused the video. "You asked a question that unequivocally revealed your lack of understanding regarding bank capital ratios. Jamie Dimon genuinely tried to educate you. You chose to ignore him because you simply didn't comprehend his answer. That, madam, is profoundly dangerous. You are regulating entire industries about which you possess no real understanding." He played several more clips. Each one showed Waters confusing concepts, asking questions based on entirely false premises, and making statements that vividly exposed significant gaps in her knowledge. Every single time, the bank CEOs or Federal Reserve officials made polite attempts to correct her. And each time, she simply plowed ahead, undeterred by facts. "Here's what truly concerns me," Kennedy said, halting the video. "You have occupied this influential position for many years now. You have a dedicated staff whose primary role should be to keep you informed and educated. You have direct access to a multitude of experts. Yet, you still haven't learned the basics. Why?" He answered his own question. "Because you don't need to understand a subject to have power over it. You can regulate industries you don't even grasp, simply because your power comes from seniority, not real expertise. You've been in that seat long enough to chair the committee by default, completely irrespective of whether you're qualified." Kennedy then pulled out more examples. "You've put forward policy recommendations that economists from all political backgrounds call completely nonsensical. You've pushed for regulations that clearly show a fundamental misunderstanding of how markets actually function. You've grilled Fed officials about topics you obviously don't comprehend. And you've managed to do all of this while controlling legislation that impacts trillions of dollars and millions of jobs." He looked at her with a serious expression. "Congresswoman, you're trying to steer a ship you don't know how to sail. You're regulating industries you don't understand. You're making policies that affect the entire economy without grasping even the most basic principles. That's more than just incompetence. That's truly dangerous. People's very livelihoods depend on you knowing what you're doing, and it's clear you don't." Waters was visibly angry now. "I don't need to know every single technical detail to provide proper oversight." "Yes, you absolutely do." Kennedy's voice rose for the first time. "You're the chairman. If you don't understand how banks operate, how can you effectively regulate them? If you don't grasp monetary policy, how can you possibly oversee the Fed? If you don't get basic economics, how can you write sound financial legislation?" He stood up, gathering his papers. "You've clung to this position for years purely through seniority, not through any merit. You've held immense power over industries you don't even comprehend. You've created policy that impacts millions of people without understanding the real consequences. And you've done it all while making yourself and your family rich. That isn't leadership. That's a con job that's been going on for 33 years. 7 rounds of exposure have happened, and now one final devastating round is coming." Kennedy stood exactly where he was, collecting all the documents he'd presented into one huge pile. It was several inches thick, the accumulated proof of 3 decades filled with corruption, incompetence, and self-serving actions. He placed his hand firmly on top of it, much like a lawyer rests his hand on a Bible before taking an oath. "Congresswoman Waters, let's just take a moment to review your career. I want to be absolutely sure I haven't missed anything significant." He then pulled out a timeline, unrolling it so the cameras could clearly see. "In 1991, you were elected to Congress. You were meant to represent South Los Angeles, one of America's absolute poorest communities. You vowed to fight for them, to be their voice, and to make their lives better. So, how exactly did that turn out?" Kennedy walked along the timeline, pointing. "From 1991 to 2024, that's 33 years. Let's take a look at the actual results. Poverty in your district went up from 23% to 31%. Median income dropped from 60% of the California average down to 53%. Crime jumped by a staggering 47%. The high school graduation rate fell by 11 points. And homelessness? It exploded by 600%. He looked up. By every single measurable indicator, your district is in a worse state now than when you first started. Every single one. Education, income, crime, poverty, homelessness, all of it is worse. You've been their representative for a third of a century, and yet they're worse off. Kennedy then moved to a completely different part of the timeline. But you, Congresswoman, you're certainly not worse off. Let's examine your own personal journey. In 1991, you were a middle-class woman. By 2000, your net worth was around $500,000. By 2010, you were a millionaire. By 2020, you were worth well over $4 million. Your net worth has skyrocketed eightfold while your constituents became poorer. Funny how that sometimes happens, isn't it? He pulled out the photo of her mansion once more. And you bought this $4.5 million home outside your district, in one of LA's most affluent neighborhoods. While the people you represent live in poverty, you live in absolute luxury. While they cope with crime and homelessness, you reside safely behind gates, complete with security. Kennedy then moved to yet another section. Now let's discuss your family. Your daughter, Karen, has earned over $1.2 million from your campaigns and from various organizations that receive your earmarks. Your husband's investment in One United Bank was rescued by a $12 million bailout that you personally arranged. Your family has profited immensely from your position of power. They are considerably better off than they were back in 1991. He pulled out the ethics violations. The House Ethics Committee has investigated you multiple times. One United Bank specifically violated House rules. There have been numerous complaints regarding campaign finance. And earmark abuses? Those have been well documented, but completely unpunished. You've been admonished, but you've faced no real consequences whatsoever. You've repeatedly broken ethics rules, and yet you've remained in power. Kennedy pulled out legislative records. Your legislative accomplishments are minimal. The bills you've passed to genuinely help your district are essentially zero. No major legislation bears your name. After 33 years, what have you truly achieved, other than getting richer yourself, along with your family? He pointed to your media appearances, noting how you've always found time for TV, hundreds of cable news interviews, thousands of tweets, and endless press conferences. You've successfully built a media brand, presenting yourself as a fighter, a resistor, and a champion for the voiceless. Yet, when we look at the real outcomes, those voiceless people are still waiting to be heard. In fact, they're even poorer than before. Then, Kennedy brought out the footage of your incitement. You've used inflammatory language, and it has directly led to violence. You've actively encouraged people to be confrontational. You've even incited harassment against public officials. You've stirred up action, but never taken responsibility for what happened afterward. And you've never once apologized for any of it. He then highlighted examples of your financial ignorance. You chair the Financial Services Committee, yet you don't even grasp basic economics. You try to regulate industries that you clearly don't understand. Your questions constantly reveal significant gaps in your own knowledge. You hold power that you simply aren't qualified to have. Kennedy gathered all the evidence back into a pile, then stood directly in front of Waters. Congresswoman Maxine Waters, 33 years serving in Congress. Your district is demonstrably worse off by every single measure. Meanwhile, your family is millions of dollars richer. You live in a mansion far outside the district you represent. You've broken ethics rules time and time again. You've used your position to enrich your own family. Your rhetoric has incited violence. You don't even understand the industries you're supposed to regulate. Legislatively, you've achieved absolutely nothing, apart from holding onto your own power. His voice was quiet, but it echoed clearly through the now silent chamber. You embody everything that's broken with career politicians in Washington. You've transformed public service into a means for private profit. You've extracted wealth from your position, while your constituents have gained nothing but deeper poverty. You've held power for 3 decades and produced no real results. You've made your family rich, while families in your district continue to struggle. Kennedy then picked up the entire pile of evidence. This represents 33 years of corruption, incompetence, and self-serving actions, all documented in official records, FEC filings, ethics reports, legislative archives, and public statements. Every single claim I've made today is fully supported by evidence. Every accusation is proven true by your own actions. He set the pile back down. The real question isn't whether you've been a corrupt, ineffective representative. The evidence clearly shows that you have been. The question is, will you finally be held accountable for it all? Will you face consequences for repeatedly breaking ethics rules? Will you face tough primary challenges from constituents who are fed up with being represented by someone who doesn't even live among them or truly understand their lives? Kennedy then looked directly into the camera. Or will you simply stay in power, keep enriching your family, keep living in your mansion, keep letting your constituents down, and continue to face no consequences? Because, for 33 years, that's exactly how it's been. And based on history, that pattern will just keep repeating itself until the voters of South Los Angeles finally decide they deserve something better. He turned back to Waters. After 33 years, Congresswoman, if your district is worse off, that's not just bad luck. That's not because of Republican obstruction. That's not some systemic anything either. No, that's a direct failure of your leadership. You've had 33 long years. The results truly speak for themselves. Your constituents are poorer. You're richer. They suffer. You prosper. That, Congresswoman, isn't representation. That's a con game that's been going on for 3 decades. Kennedy sat back down, folding his hands calmly. I have no further questions. I believe the evidence speaks for itself. The entire room was engulfed in stunned silence. Waters looked as though she'd just been hit by a truck. Her attorneys were whispering to each other, absolutely frantic. Democrats on the committee simply stared down at their desks. Republicans, meanwhile, were struggling to keep straight faces. And somewhere in South Los Angeles, Waters's constituents watched, silently wondering why it took a senator from Louisiana to finally voice what they had been thinking for years. The video of the exchange went viral even before the hearing had officially ended. Staffers were already texting clips around. News outlets were scrambling to cover it. Social media was absolutely exploding. Kennedy destroys Maxine Waters was trending worldwide within the hour. By the next morning, the full video had racked up 80 million views across all platforms. Not just clips, mind you, but the entire 2-hour hearing. People were actually watching the whole thing from start to finish. Kennedy's methodical dismantling of Waters's career unfolded like a gripping legal drama, with each round building on the last, and every piece of evidence proving more damning than the one before. CNN tried to frame it as a mere partisan attack, but even their own legal analysts were forced to admit the evidence was rock solid. Senator Kennedy presented documentation for every single claim, one analyst begrudgingly conceded. These aren't just allegations, they added. These are documented facts, straight from public records. MSNBC tried to bring in people to defend Waters, but it was a real struggle for them. How exactly do you defend someone who lives in a $4.5 million mansion when their own district is deep in poverty? And how do you explain away her daughter making 10 times the market rate from her mother's political campaigns? What justification is there for a district that has only gotten worse over 3 decades? Even typically liberal news outlets couldn't fully come to her defense. The Washington Post even ran its own fact check. Their conclusion: Kennedy's claims about Waters' district, her family's enrichment, and the ethics violations were mostly accurate. Mostly accurate was the strongest defense they could offer. But the true impact was felt right there, in her district. Within just 48 hours, protests erupted outside her Los Angeles office. These weren't small gatherings. Hundreds of people showed up, many of them her own constituents. Their signs declared, 33 years of failure. Move back to South LA, our poverty, your mansion, and simply, fire Maxine. A longtime community activist who had supported Waters for years gave a powerful interview. He said, "We've been loyal to her for decades. We even defended her when Republicans attacked her. But Senator Kennedy just laid out facts that we simply cannot ignore. She doesn't even live here anymore. She's gotten rich, and we've only gotten poorer. Her daughter is making millions from campaigns. We can't defend this any longer." The House Ethics Committee, which had been sitting on complaints against Waters for years, suddenly announced they were launching a new investigation. Under immense pressure from the viral video and widespread public outrage, they just couldn't ignore it any longer. They committed to reviewing the one united matter, the family enrichment schemes, the earmark patterns, everything Kennedy had meticulously documented. Even more significantly, a primary challenger emerged within just 1 week. A young, progressive Democrat from South LA announced her intention to challenge Waters. Her entire campaign was built squarely on Kennedy's presentation. 33 years of failure. It was time, she argued, for new leadership that actually lived in the district, understood its needs, and would truly fight for it. The polling numbers were absolutely devastating for Waters. In her very own district, her approval rating plummeted to just 47%. For the first time in decades, she was deeply unpopular with her own voters. When constituents were asked if they preferred new leadership, a striking 61% said yes. Even her fellow Congressional Black Caucus members started to distance themselves. They couldn't afford to be seen defending corruption, especially when it was so thoroughly documented. Some even admitted privately what they could never say out loud. Kennedy had been right all along. Waters had been getting away with this for far too long. The very appropriations she had controlled began to dry up. Organizations that once hired Karen Waters suddenly announced they were taking their consulting business in a different direction. The pay-to-play scheme Kennedy exposed had simply become too hot for anyone to touch. Karen Waters' consulting business completely collapsed. The organizations that had paid her inflated fees simply stopped calling. Politicians who had previously hired her just to get Maxine's endorsement quickly found other consultants. That money pipeline Kennedy documented essentially shut down almost overnight. Waters herself became toxic. Her speaking fees vanished. Organizations that once paid her $20,000 per speech started finding other speakers. The media appearances she had always craved became incredibly scarce. Networks no longer wanted to give airtime to someone who had been exposed so thoroughly. But perhaps the most symbolic moment arrived 3 months after that hearing. A for sale sign suddenly appeared outside her Hancock Park mansion. She was actually selling her home. Speculation swirled. Maybe she couldn't afford it anymore without Karen's consulting fees, especially with her political career now in jeopardy. Or perhaps she had finally received the clear message that living in luxury while representing poverty was simply indefensible. Either way, that mansion, which had symbolized her disconnect from her constituents, was now officially on the market. Kennedy's point had definitely hit home. The primary election, held 6 months later, wasn't even close. Waters lost by a shocking 19 points. 19 points to a challenger who had never held office, who had only a tenth of Waters' campaign money, and zero name recognition. But that challenger had something Waters simply did not. She lived in the district, she understood the district, and she hadn't spent 33 years enriching herself while her constituents suffered. On election night, Waters delivered a visibly bitter concession speech. She blamed Republicans, she blamed racism, and she blamed outside interference. She never once acknowledged what Kennedy had so clearly documented, that she had failed her constituents for 3 decades while enriching herself and her family. When asked about it during a press conference, Kennedy's response was characteristically modest. He said, "I just asked questions and presented facts directly from public records." If that's controversial, if that's considered a partisan attack, then maybe the real problem isn't the questions themselves. Maybe the problem is actually the conduct. Someone then asked if he felt responsible for ending her career. Kennedy just offered that signature Louisiana smile. "I didn't end her career," he replied. "Her record ended her career. I just made sure people saw it for what it was. All I did was shine a light. And the roaches scattered when that light came on. It's not my fault, though. That's just how they are." This hearing actually turned into required viewing for political science classes. The Kennedy-Waters hearing got picked apart for how effective it was, how it used evidence, and its super-methodical structure. Professors then used it to teach their students about accountability, about the right way to present evidence, and about the sheer importance of good documentation. But for everyday Americans, especially those folks over 60 who'd seen career politicians get rich themselves for decades, the truth was much simpler than all that. They'd witnessed a Louisiana lawyer, speaking with a slow draw, systematically dismantle a career politician using her very own record. No tricks, no spin, just pure facts and cold, hard receipts. Maxine Waters, you see, had spent 33 years building up her power, piling up wealth, and expertly avoiding accountability. Yet, it only took John Kennedy one single hearing to bring her entire house of cards down. And that's because he'd done something truly radical in modern politics. He'd actually held a powerful person accountable using nothing but solid evidence and undeniable facts. That message reverberated far beyond just that hearing room. You know, career politicians who get rich themselves while their constituents suffer, who regularly violate ethics rules without ever facing consequences, and who hold on to power through sheer seniority instead of actual merit. Well, their time was rapidly running out. Someone was finally watching. Someone was diligently documenting everything, and someone had the receipts. And sometimes that someone happens to have a thick Louisiana drawl and a legal pad absolutely jam-packed with evidence. Senator Kennedy accomplished what journalists should have done decades ago, quite frankly. He meticulously investigated Maxine Waters, then presented the undeniable evidence of her corruption and her incompetence in a way that simply couldn't be ignored, nor could it be spun away. Imagine 33 years of her enriching herself while her constituents suffered immensely. Then there was $1 million going straight to her daughter from campaign funds, plus ethics violations for actively helping her husband's bank. And let's not forget a mansion situated far outside her district, while her own constituents languished in poverty. Her inflammatory rhetoric that consistently incites violence. Then there was her fundamental ignorance about the very industries she was supposed to regulate, and her family enrichment schemes all funded directly by taxpayers. Kennedy laid it all bare, armed with that signature Louisiana charm and those absolutely devastating receipts. He never yelled, He didn't once insult anyone. Instead, he simply presented fact after fact, document after document, meticulously showing exactly who Maxine Waters really was, and precisely what she'd truly done with her 33 years in power. So, share this with anyone who's fed up with career politicians getting rich, while everyday Americans struggle and get poorer. Don't forget to comment below. After 3 decades of failure, did Maxine Waters truly deserve to finally lose her seat, because her constituents were finally getting the representation they genuinely deserved? Someone who actually stood up and represented them instead of simply exploiting them. The receipts, my friends, they simply don't lie. Kennedy brought every single one of them. And now, career politicians everywhere are undoubtedly nervous, left wondering if they're going to be next. Because what if someone decides to dig into their records the same way Kennedy dug into Waters's? Then, what will they actually find? Probably exactly what Kennedy found buried in that very folder. Decades of corruption that had openly thrived in the darkness until someone finally decided to turn on the light.